Hi, my name's Kelsey Stokes with the Lanier Law Firm. I'm here with my colleague David Hobbs, and we're here to talk about a case that we've been investigating for the better part of a year. The case involves scopes, scopes that are used in what are supposed to be routine procedures done by healthy Americans in the millions per year. Specifically, we're talking about reusable scopes. Olympus is the number one manufacturer of these reusable scopes. So these are scopes that are used, for example, in colonoscopies, which is the most common scope procedure performed throughout the United States. We're also looking at scopes used in upper endoscopies or gastroscopes, or scopes used when you go in for a procedure to scope your lungs. In addition to those procedures, we're looking at duodenoscopes that are used in what's known as an ERCP. So all of these scopes are reusable. And what that means is the scope that is being used in your routine colonoscopy more than likely has been used in prior patients, potentially dozens or hundreds of prior patients. In theory, if you reuse the scope, that scope should be sterile, it should be free of any microorganisms or any organisms at all that could hurt you. But what we have discovered is that by the design of this device, it is impossible to clean. Even when a healthcare provider, such as a hospital or a surgical center, follows the instructions for use that accompany these devices, these instructions for use that are written by the manufacturer, they follow the instructions to a T, these devices are still not clean. So what does that mean? That means that when you go into a procedure, there could be tissue from another patient that is then put into you during your scope procedure. And it's not just tissue. These could be microorganisms or what's known as multi-drug resistant organisms, commonly known as superbugs. You could actually get that and within hours, days, or weeks after a scope procedure become infected, get sepsis, have significant major organ failure, and in tragic cases, you could die. That is what we have seen. We discovered this, Hobbs, when we were looking at the adverse event data that the FDA puts out. And what we found was a disturbing pattern that patients, after undergoing these scope procedures, within days would become infected with superbugs. And again, in tragic instances, they would die. So, you might think to yourself, that must be an outlier. No way could that happen to me. Well, Hobbs, you've done some pretty significant research on the potential impact across the country of these problematic reusable scopes. So what do you think the numbers look like?
Well, first let's talk about how many procedures there actually are. The most common procedure in the United States involving this is a colonoscopy. There are various estimates to that, but Olympus actually has its own estimates that it published late last year, and they have it between 17 to 20 million colonoscopies per year in the United States. On top of that, you're going to have upper endoscopies, so that's those are going to be another 5 to 10 million, and then you'll have bronchoscopes. Those will be another 1.5 million a year, and you'll have the ERCP procedures at roughly 500 to 700,000 procedures per year. And then when you're looking at the number of procedures, the question then is okay, how common are these unexpected infections where bacteria is left on a scope that then is introduced into another patient and that other patient gets sick? Original estimates, so if you go back and look 20 years ago, 10 years ago, when they were looking at this, studies were showing the infection rates were really low. So you were looking at 0.00001%. So a very small number of patients infected. More recent studies have shown that infection rate is actually significantly higher. Depending on the type of the procedure, it's going to be between 0.01% and 2% chance of infection.
What does that translate to? So you're saying we're looking at 30 million plus of these routine procedures, scope procedures per year, right? 30 million per year. And so you might think 2% is a small percentage, but what does that actually equate to?
Well, if we were doing 2%, I mean, if it was 2% across the board, the numbers would be huge. But even if we're just assuming a sort of mixed percentage of 0.1%, we're still looking at 30,000 plus potential infections per year. And that corresponds pretty nicely with, so one of the things that we did is we looked at what's called the FDA MOD adverse event reporting. That's where physicians, manufacturers, even patients can report information to the FDA when a adverse event like an infection happens. And just looking from 2015, there were 10,000 reports related to these scopes, related to either infection or contamination of the scopes. And then when looking at those groups of reports, you might say, okay, well, maybe this is the same incident being reported over and over and over again. We see that there are at least, and you can't necessarily always tell from the data, but there are at least 2,500 separate incidents. So these occurred at separate times, separate places, represented in that reporting. And we know from our experience in other litigation involving medical devices and in pharmaceuticals that the FDA adverse event data is, adverse events are significantly underreported by multiple factors. And so the anticipation is that the numbers are going to be much larger than what we see in the FDA data, and again correspond to sort of these newer estimates from studies, and they may even be higher.
And talking about these MDRs, is medical device reports, adverse events that you see when you go onto the FDA's website, they're underreported for several reasons. One of which is that there's not mandatory reporting in the United States. In other words, if there's an issue, maybe a doctor or a hospital doesn't have the time to report it. That's one reason. But the other reason is when the manufacturer who becomes aware of the report does not properly report it to FDA. And what we have seen with this company, who is the number one, over 75% of the market share, number one manufacturer of these scopes, this company has actually been dinged with fines and criminal, has actually had criminal charges for not accurately reporting MDRs. And so in particular, not only are across the board in medical devices are adverse events underreported, in particular, for the scope procedures done using an Olympus, a reusable Olympus scopes, we think that those are going to be significantly underreported. Do you agree with that?
Right. Well, and you even have, about 2 years ago, there was a whistleblower lawsuit filed by an employee of the company that precisely that they were not reporting adverse event data correctly. They were not accurately tracking issues with their products. And they were not incorporating those into their design and marketing decisions.
You know, I want to talk about, you made it a point to say that that there's separate cases, right? That separate, not just one outbreak. What we've seen in the medical literature is that there's reports of outbreaks in certain regions where the scope is used. And what you're saying is it's not just little clusters of outbreaks. It's all throughout the United States we're seeing these infections.
Correct.
Wow. Okay. So another thing this is very disturbing. First of all, just to think that when you go in for a routine colonoscopy, that you could have another patient's bacteria go into your body. That's disturbing. What we saw in the published literature was that for the bronchoscopes used in bronchoscopies or procedures where the lung is looked at, that if somebody has tuberculosis, a prior patient has tuberculosis, that because of this defective design, because these devices, even following the instructions, cannot be cleaned, that tuberculosis organism gets implanted in the next patient or patients after that infected patient.
No, it's very disturbing, and there's even, frankly, more terrifying information out there, which is that actual tissue, so not just bacteria that you can't see, but actual tissue can get transplanted from these scopes into another patient. So tissue from one person ends up in the tissue of another, even after the scope has gone through at the manufacturer's cleaning process. There's actually a device, a system that the manufacturer has built that is supposed to automatically clean these. And even after going through that, you can still have this bacteria. You'll still find even tissue from prior patients that gets in the next patient's body.
And that's such an important point. So when the hospital trusts in the manufacturer who makes these reusable scopes and gets devices made by that same manufacturer to clean it, they should be able to trust that these devices are going to be properly cleaned before they use them in their next patient. And what we are seeing is that they in fact are not, even using the manufacturer's own cleaning device.
Yeah, and that's something that there's been some FDA action on this, but what we know is that Olympus is aware of this issue. It's aware that these reusable scopes cannot be properly cleaned. They cannot be completely cleaned. You cannot trust that they're clean. And so the question is why do we use them? Why do we have them? Why do they continue to sell them?
Right, and why are they not warning providers that this is a possibility and that maybe you should test the scope to see if these organisms are present prior to using it on a patient? There's any number of ways they could have fixed this problem, and they haven't. And they've known for years. There's actually a study, if I remember correctly, there's a study that Olympus itself performed, and every step of the way they stopped to look at the success, even again following the instructions for use provided by Olympus, the success of the cleaning process, following it to the T, and every step of the way it failed. There was failure. Is that what you saw?
That's what the study showed. Correct.
Wow, this is amazing. So, how do you know if you potentially have a claim? Here's what you need to be aware of, is if you have had a scope procedure, so again, a colonoscopy, an upper endoscopy, bronchoscopy, that's the lung procedure, or the procedure known as an ERCP. Any of these scope procedures, and you've had that since 2015, even going back to 2015, and afterwards, within, I would say, days, weeks, about 30 days is probably, at that point where we could plausibly say this is related to the device. So if you have had a procedure and within days or weeks have had an infection that has required hospitalization, then you could have a claim. Also, very disturbing, again, the tuberculosis is a potential infection, along with HIV even. There's published literature that has shown that patients have been infected with HIV after undergoing these scope procedures. Again, the infection is typically going to be one of these drug-resistant organisms or superbugs. So if you've been hospitalized after having a scope procedure, within days or weeks of that scope procedure, you could have a claim. Why should you choose Lanier? There's law firms, I'm sure you've seen advertisements for law firms out, across the country, but why should you choose Lanier? Well, I'm sure Hobbs is going to add to this, but I can tell you that we actually care about every single client who calls in. If you call in and you want us to investigate your claim, we are going to take that seriously. You are going to get personalized care, and you are going to talk to an actual human being who's going to investigate your claim. We have had success in the billions, not only in settlements, but also in verdicts. Many of you have likely seen the recent reports of Mark Lanier and Rachel Lanier's trial against Meta and YouTube, where Mark actually crossed Mark Zuckerberg. That was a successful result. We have had successful results that are not as publicized, but go ahead and check our website out, Lanier Law Firm. So Hobbs, why should clients choose Lanier?
So as I said, we have extensive experience in, particularly when we're talking about this, in medical device litigation. This is a pretty specialized area, and so you have to have a lot of understanding of not only the science and the medicine of how these products are used, but you have to have, there's a extensive legal framework that makes these very complex and very difficult to pursue if you're not prepared. And so we've, Kelsey here, she has been appointed by multiple courts as what are called leads in these large-scale litigations involving these medical devices, and so she can talk a little bit about her experience. But this is something that we've done for many, many years, and we've done very successfully.
Yeah, I can't stress enough that not every single law firm can handle a medical device case, especially of this magnitude. But we here at Lanier Law Firm are specially equipped to handle it because of the experience that both Hobbs and I have on plaintiff steering committees, and as well as several attorneys, including Mark Lanier himself, who's led numerous litigations against these major pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers to a successful resolution, in many instances in the billions. Again, go to the Lanier Law Firm, lanierlawfirm.com, go to our website, check us out. If you've had a scope procedure since 2015 and within days or weeks you have experienced an infection that landed you in the hospital, then you could have a claim.